Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our third and final day of our three-day third-party risk management bootcamp. We hope you found the last 2 days of this virtual camping trip valuable, as we certainly covered a lot of third-party risk management material. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you're not familiar with our webinars or have not been on any of the bootcamp days thus far, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. We keep track of all questions throughout each session, so you'll hear us answer some live, but those that we do not get to right away, we will address with you via email. Before we get started, let's recap a bit. In day one, we covered inherent risk versus residual vendor risk and strategies for vendor due diligence. On day two, we talked about critical vendors, fourth parties, and exit strategies within your vendor contracts, third-party risk management and supply chain, understanding vendor data breaches, and complementary user entity controls within vendor SOC reports. That brings us to today, the third and final day of our bootcamp, where we'll start with an emerging topic, ESG. Is your organization ready? Then vendor financial health in today's business climate. After that, we'll take a brief break, and then we'll cover the importance of vendor performance management and wrap up with metrics and reporting. In the related content widget, you'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our resources library, and links to several specific resources we feel will be helpful. Today's live session is eligible for up to 2 CPE credits. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentations. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the bootcamp has concluded that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. For the next hour, VinMinder's Hillary Dewhurst, Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, will discuss ESG in determining if your organization is ready. After that, Raman Zachariah, VinMinder's Chief Financial Officer, will join us to discuss vendor financial health in today's business climate. With that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. So today we are going to very quickly go through what ESG, CSR, and the triple bottom line are. And we're going to talk about ESG in terms of transparency and reporting and the regulatory environment. But most of all, we're going to jump into how you can incorporate ESG into your third-party risk management framework. When it comes to ESG and the third-party risk management lifecycle, ESG is another risk that we would identify as part of our inherent risk assessment. We would investigate the vendor's controls and practices around that during due diligence, and it's something that we would monitor and manage throughout the relationship with the vendor. Okay, so what is ESG? Well, the acronym ESG refers to environmental, social, and governance, which are 3 key factors that contribute to measuring the sustainability and ethical impacts of an organization's business practices. ESG frameworks are intended to help organizations assess and disclose their sustainability and ethical practices and represent a more stakeholder-centric approach to doing business. In addition to customers, those stakeholders include investors, employees, suppliers, and communities worldwide that are affected by the practices and decisions of an organization. Investors in particular are interested in ESG data as part of a broader calculation to estimate an organization's long-term value. Now, before ESG, there was CSR, which stands for Corporate Social Responsibility. And that might feel a lot more familiar to you because a lot of organizations have had these programs for a while. A lot of these programs focus on things like donations, scholarships, employee volunteering, etc. And they're designed by the organization. They really had no rules or guidelines. And so the public has become somewhat jaded about CSR because too many organizations had really lofty statements without any real substance. So this is where ESG comes into play. ESG provides transparency and objective measurement of those ethical, statements and values. So a good way to think about the difference between CSR and ESG is to think about CSR as what we say and ESG is what we do. If you have a annual report with a lot of information, lots of beautiful pictures about how you want a healthy planet for healthy communities, for example, that's great, but without any real actions and measurements of those actions, those statements are just kind of empty platitudes. So if you look at both sides here, it says for Healthy Planet, they have a greenhouse gas emissions report, which is great. They're measuring their greenhouse gas emissions against the objective to reduce the emissions. So now you can see how CSR and ESG are different. Ultimately, both CSR and ESG have foundations in sustainability. So what does that mean? Well, in a nutshell, the concept of sustainability means that we can meet our needs today without impacting the ability for future generations to meet their needs. In addition to all the natural resources, we also need social and economic resources. Sustainability includes environmental, social, and financial. And this is closely related to something called the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line is a popular financial theory that's closely related to ESG. And this theory posits that the bottom line, which has been traditionally thought of as profits, should also include the consideration of people and the planet as well. That is because there are non-financial elements that can directly influence the health and sustainability of an organization and impact its ability to be safe and profitable. Now we're going to take a very quick look at each of these elements. Let's start with environmental, and these are all the issues involving the planet and the use of natural resources, and includes how the organization is impacting the earth, not just them directly, but also in consideration of their vendors. And we have to always think about the products or services, what's happening to them after they're in the hands of the customer. That includes the product life cycle and how they're recycled or disposed. The list of examples here is really short, considering all the issues that might be covered under environmental, but the big themes are climate change, water, energy efficiency, pollution, ocean conservation, etc. Social issues are about the consideration and treatment of people. Remember, this is just not employees, but all people, including customers, investors, vendors, and the people in the community and across the world. There are a lot of issues associated with social, from the most extreme issues such as human rights violations and modern slavery to things like health, education, and labor practices. Interestingly, social issues and considerations also include the rights of the customer, such as privacy and security. Governance issues speak to how the organization is managed and their ethics and moral standards. It also considers the structures to hold people accountable. Another really interesting dimension of governance is risk management. So is the organization proactively managing risk to reduce the likelihood, occurrence, and impact of their customers, stakeholders, and investors? Okay, that was really quick, but I hope we're getting the ESG concept. All the issues and considerations hopefully are making more sense than they did about 5 minutes ago. And with that, we're going to dive into our first poll question.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. Our first question is, does your organization currently have a CSR or ESG program? Yes, no, but one is in the works, no, or you're not sure. Hillary, we have some time right now. We can answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience.
All right.
Great. Does a company have to have CSR to have ESG, or can it be standalone?
Well, yes, the company can have CSR without having ESG, because CSR is really sort of that corporate program that's talking about what the organization wants to do to be responsible to the community, to the environment, to its employees. And as a matter of fact, many companies have standalone CSR. But what's important to understand is that ESG in the context that we're discussing today and in the broader context is really about that transparency and reporting against those types of CSR goals. So, for example, if you say that you're good for the environment, then ESG transparency and reporting would mean that you are actually reporting against your objectives and you have specific metrics that can help measure your progress in those areas. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as the thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, in the related content widget, please be aware we've provided our Integrating ESG into Your Third-Party Risk Management Framework toolkit. This all-encompassing toolkit provides an infographic, white paper, checklist, CSR and ESG sample vendor questionnaire, and modern slavery and human trafficking statement template. Back to you, Hillary.
So there are a couple of ESG issues that are getting a lot more attention right now, and those are climate change and modern slavery or forced labor. Let's just talk about climate change for a minute. Beyond being a hot topic, climate change is a serious financial issue. It's also considered a systemic risk. Systemic risks are those that can spark a major collapse in an industry or the broader economy. And no matter where you sit on the climate change debate, the unfortunate truth is that once any issue boils down to money, people tend to pay attention. When it comes to climate change, there are 2 types of risks. There's the physical risk, which includes destruction of assets, workforce migration, low food production, or more frequent and intense natural disasters and events. And even if the event isn't disastrous, they still interrupt business. So just the past few months in the United States, we've seen incredible record-breaking snowstorms. We've seen incredible rain, floods, tornadoes. All of these things can literally paralyze entire regions of the country at a time. But we also have something called transition risk. And that's the risk of moving away from all these carbon-intensive assets like fossil fuels or shipping or energy production. If you devalue all the carbon-intensive assets too rapidly, you can also have major economic collapse. Another super problematic ESG issue is modern slavery. And you may have heard this referred to as forced labor or human trafficking. In the United States, for example, we have a real aversion to using the word slavery in a current context. Unfortunately, slavery is exactly what we're talking about. And it seems incredible, but this is a very profitable business. It's worth about $150 billion annually. And it's very prevalent because the problem is it can be hard to detect because extended or obscured supply chains and because there are so many corrupt organizations out there. Modern slavery takes many forms, but let's look at some of the more common ones. Unfortunately, there are way too many varieties of modern slavery today, and the sad part is that women and children are very vulnerable to these practices. We see things like bonded labor and forced labor, and even child labor is very common in industries like commercial fishing, forestry, construction, mining, across supply chains across the world. So we need to be very aware of the different ways that modern slavery or forced labor can occur. I do want to draw your attention to something that you'll hear about. This is called a modern slavery or forced labor statement. These are basically formal documents put together at the highest level of the organization that really talk about the modern slavery risks in the operation and the supply chains. It also details what actions the organization is taking, what is it doing during due diligence, etc., and includes how the entity knows that their efforts are effective. Now, all of this information is formalized, it's signed off and approved at the highest level of the organization, and is usually made public. So your logical next question, because there's so many issues, like what are the laws? What regulations do we have to force organizations to be transparent? Well, we actually have quite a few laws and regs prohibiting human trafficking and forced labor, but in the United States, there aren't any laws that mandate ESG disclosures for now. You may have heard the controversy that the SEC wants to make sure that all public companies have specific ESG disclosures that follow a defined standard. And if that does become a regulation, it will be a real game changer and will put that ESG ball in motion for all public companies. So the new proposed rule would standardize the way that companies disclose climate-related risks to the public and their investors. Now, this is important because you may think differently about investing, say, in a beachside housing development if you knew that in 10 years, half of those houses would be destroyed by hurricanes, rising sea levels, or beach erosion, right? So we need disclosure rules to ensure that companies not only consider the potential risks, but that they're reporting them and they're showing how those risks might impact the bottom line both now and in years to come. So outside the U.S., the EU and the U.K. do have some existing and proposed regulations, and they've really been the leaders in this space. And of course, there's other countries with their own regulations related to ESG, but nothing is comprehensive right now. And that's because there's no global standard to adhere to. So without these ESG reporting requirements and standards, organizations are not necessarily compelled by law to disclose very much. All right, I think it's time for another poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization consider ESG factors as part of vendor management? We're looking into it, but it's not yet part of our process. We consider ESG as part of our vendor vetting. Not applicable, not sure, or I'm first hearing about this now. Hillary, I have another question here that I think we could go ahead and answer. We don't have any ESG or CSR in place. Should we wait until they figure out the regulations or get started now?
It depends, and it really has a lot to do with what your organization is doing around this particular issue in general. So even though some of the regulations are not very well sussed out, especially in the U.S., a lot of companies still move forward with ESG, mostly because their investors and their customers want it. So it really depends on if that is a pressure or a concern for your organization overall. I would recommend, though, even if that's not the case, to really start looking into it, because eventually these regulations will manifest and there will be requirements. But it's always good to start thinking about what you would need to do, how that would affect your vendor base, doing the research to see what kind of issues that you might be tracking or looking at is always going to be helpful. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Hillary. Please go ahead and get those responses in. We will be closing this poll in just about 10 seconds. Thank you. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I'd like to direct your attention to the related content widget, where you'll find our third-party risk management lifecycle toolkit. All of the areas covered during this bootcamp take place at some point within the third-party risk management lifecycle. This toolkit walks you through it from start to finish with an infographic, ebook, one-pager, and PowerPoint template. I'll hand it back to you, Hillary.
So if the regulations aren't that plentiful, why are organizations choosing to report on ESG issues? And it comes down to something called soft law. Soft law is basically ethical standards versus legal ones, and it's always adhered to voluntarily. Countries will come together and agree to follow specific standards and hold each other accountable, and member countries use mechanisms like trade and financial sanctions to drive compliance. So the United Nations, for example, works on soft law principles. While goodwill and cooperation can be really effective, it still all comes down to money because investors can always apply pressure that the government can't. And ESG was born out of investor pressure. You know, these investors, they understand the implications surrounding ESG, and so they want those companies to be transparent. But financial investors of ESG have also sort of evolved into a separate class of investor who just merely wants to invest in the companies with the most sustainable practices. So organizations are paying attention and doing this ESG reporting. Beyond disclosure and reporting, many organizations are turning to external firms to provide them with an ESG rating. And those ratings are sending signals to the investors that they're serious about ESG by taking that extra step and engaging an unbiased third party to objectively rate their efforts and progress. The one thing to keep in mind here is that when it comes to ESG ratings, there aren't any set standards for those either, and the methods for calculating and defining results vary. So what do we know here? No real regulations, most disclosure reporting is voluntary, and for now, soft law and investor pressures are the driving force behind ESG. Okay, so how does this all translate into your third-party risk management program? Well, first of all, third-party risk management has a really important role in your organization's ESG efforts. We're all outsourcing, and that needs to be part of the whole ESG story. But organizational ESG maturity is really all over the place. So there's a huge amount of complexity here. If you hear anything today, it is this. Please do not rush all willy-nilly into a vendor risk ESG integration, because I can guarantee you that poor planning and rushing will cause you extra work and wasted resources in the end. But most importantly, your organization's reputation could suffer if ESG is not handled correctly. And that is why I'm strongly advising that if you are tasked with just getting it done, you stand firm, raise your hand, and demand guidance and collaboration. Okay, before getting started, there's some essential information we need to know. The first of which is, what is our organization's commitment to ESG? And who is going to own ESG at the organization? Is that part of a working group, a committee, an individual? And who is the subject matter expert? Who's going to give us the guidance? Is that someone internally or externally? And we also need to know what the organizational focus is going to be on transparency and reporting, or are there specific goals that are being set? We also need to understand if third-party risk management is currently in scope for ESG, and if not, when will it be? And as part of that, which third parties are we going to include? Are we going to base that on their risk profile, product or service, spend, et cetera? And then finally, what is the expected time frame for third-party ESG compliance? Remember, you can't rush this, so if someone's just throwing out a date on best guess, we're going to need to revisit that. Okay, if you've been tasked with taking some action, we can do something practical today, but we have to keep it really simple. We can send out a very basic ESG questionnaire, or we can just ask two questions, which is, does the third party have any ESG reporting, and do they have a modern slavery, forced labor, or human trafficking statement? Those are a really good baseline to start with. If you have a little bit more sophisticated ESG questionnaire, you might also be able to determine if they have a program in place and are they making any progress on their goals. You don't need to be a subject matter expert for that, but once we start analyzing the actual results of reporting, that's when we definitely need our SME. So eventually, ESG is going to become another risk domain that we look at in due diligence. And of course, the true assessment of those risks and the controls are going to require a dedicated subject matter expert. But before you are looking to measure and rate a vendor's ESG risk, your organization has to be able to determine how inherent risk is identified for ESG and what controls are necessary to mitigate it. I recommend that before you start any concentrated ESG efforts that you do that simple review of if they have ESG reporting and a modern slavery statement. But you'll need to work with SMEs to eventually determine how to incorporate ESG as a true due diligence component. And you know, it's not just your due diligence process that's going to require amendment. Let's think about our governance documentation and our contracts. How are we going to monitor ESG risk? Do we have the resources and expertise to do that? How might that look for the vendor owners? And how are we going to communicate all these requirements to the vendors? What are we going to do about noncompliance when it's likely that ESG is not written into your contractual considerations today? And finally, what ESG metrics are going to be incorporated into your third-party risk management reporting, especially your board reporting? Of course, your vendors are going to play a huge part in these ESG efforts, so we need to be really sensitive as to what level of change it might represent for them, and how are we going to work that timing into our plans. This is why it's really important to have a good sense of which vendors are going to be in scope is really important. And I would always advise a series of communications on the change, working way out, because we need to give our vendors a really good amount of time to move the direction we expect them to, and we need to continually communicate as we move towards the goal. So we've covered so much in such a short time, but there's some key takeaways. Make sure you understand your organization's objectives and goals for ESG before you go about integrating that into your third-party risk management program. That means being part of that committee, having those conversations, and having access to an SME. You will need to think about how this is going to impact and change your program components overall, whether that's your contracts or your due diligence process, and you're going to have to consider what this means for the vendors. All of this means that we're going to need a lot of time to get it done, and so we need to be realistic. But most of all, we need to keep our eye on the ball and pay attention to these regulations as they're becoming more formal, because that could mean additional changes down the road. Now with that, I will turn it back over to Jessie.
Thanks so much, Hillary, for that informative session. I'd now like to introduce Raman Zachariah, VinMinder's Chief Financial Officer, who will discuss financial health in today's business climate. Raman, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Jesse, and hey, everyone. I'm just going to quickly go over some agenda items and then dive right into today's bootcamp presentation on financial health. So we'll hit on 4 key points and 4 key sections across the next following slides. So hopefully this is informative for you all. We'll focus on why financial health is more relevant today than ever. Also focus on some of the key financial documentation you should try to acquire and review. We'll also focus on how to get information from your vendors. And finally, we'll end with some key takeaways and what you can do in your organization with respect to financial health reviews. So let's talk about where you perform financial health reviews within the vendor or third-party risk management lifecycle. You really focus on financial health reviews within the onboarding and the ongoing phases, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can execute on them and who you involve in each of these processes going forward. So good to keep this in mind on an ongoing basis. So you want to focus on the onboarding side and ongoing element of the third-party risk management lifecycle for your third-party reviews as it pertains to financial health. So as many of you may be aware of recent events regarding bank failures, such as the Silicon Valley Bank situation, the Signature Bank situation, and then also the Credit Suisse situation, it's always good to be proactive as it pertains to your due diligence, especially on the financial health side. So use these circumstances and learnings from these situations to get ahead of performing financial due diligence on your vendors and really digging into things like their banking relationships as well to get a better sense of their overall financial viability and profile during the onboarding phase as well as the ongoing phase. This will help put internal controls and mitigants in place for your business to avoid long-standing issues that might result from these types of failures on the vendor side. So always try to be proactive in your financial health assessments and due diligence practices. So to dig in further on how financial health assessments fit into all these situations, you want to make sure that you're doing financial health assessments on all of your critical and moderate critical vendors, and then extend some type of screening or monitoring across the rest of your vendor universe as it pertains to financial health. That will ensure you can identify future risks and you don't stay in this static posture as it pertains to looking at your vendor's financial health, and you can focus your time and highest and best use of that time on the risks that are the largest or the most critical vendors, or a combination of both. Capturing things like their banking relationships is also important. So keep that in mind as you're doing your financial health reviews and other third-party due diligence reviews across your third-party risk management program. So again, we always get the questions of how could we prevent these things? And in retrospect, in hindsight, it's always easy to identify those red flags and try to mitigate around them. But again, it happens so fast, but you always can be proactive and control what you can control. So do not necessarily rely on auditors or agencies by themselves to do the in-depth due diligence that's required by your program. So try to get ahead of those and try to get ahead of what they put out with their reviews, and don't only rely on a third-party rating agency or even a third party like an auditor for that specific vendor to give you those details that are necessary for your own defined third-party risk management program and needs for compliance and governance. So to talk about that a little bit further, what else you can do to reinforce the need for ample due diligence and in-depth due diligence, again, specifically in this case pertaining to financial health reviews, is don't assume that one or any one diligence activity is all-encompassing and prevents all risk. There's always going to be risk. It just depends on how you've defined the risk and how you work to mitigate it, or frankly accept it based on your internal organization's policy. So always try to get as much of a picture and a comprehensive view and thorough view of that vendor relationships risks and how you all will react to them. And use those due diligence workflows and financial health reviews to prepare for things like the worst case scenarios, and have action plans or business contingency plans, business resiliency plans to act upon those in different circumstances if there are certain areas of financial health review that speak to too much risk being taken on by your organization. And then obviously always put these in place and test them, because once again, these things come very fast and there's always an evolving lens of information being spread on any given situation at the wrong time. So you want to try to be prepared as possible, understanding that, again, you can't control all of it, but at least you can reduce or at least mitigate the lasting business impacts it has on your organization and your organization's customers. And just to kind of complete the couple points you could do before we dive into the rest of the material, again, be proactive with your due diligence and don't rely on any one institution like a rating agency or a regulatory institution. Just get ahead of it as much as you can by yourself. Doing something or doing something very minimal is better than doing nothing. And obviously, try to remove any noise and distraction and focus on the risks that matter the most. And again, if for the best bang for your buck, if you have limited time and resources, try to focus on those critical and high critical vendors within your organization. So given all of that information about recent events, what can you do today to start as it pertains to vendor financial health reviews? You've joined the right webinar for certain to talk about some of the best practices. But getting started can be as simple as creating a questionnaire and sending it to the vendor when you're contracting and when you're onboarding them. It can also be as complex as dealing with large vendors that have complex financials. So we'll try to simplify the best practices and approaches you can utilize. And remember, you always want to start small and continue to evolve, and you never want to wait for either internal or external guidance to drive your vendor financial due diligence, because it's good to be proactive across the board, as we saw with the prior information presented. So to further emphasize why it's important to get started now, we talked about this within the context of getting ahead of some of those risks that happen in a macroeconomic environment. But being proactive is very critical, not just obviously within financial health reviews, but across other areas of the organization's third-party risk management program. And as we'll talk about on the next few slides, you want to try to avoid the domino effect of what happens with declining financial performance, because it could lead to downstream risks and impacts on your organization more broadly. So these ultimately together will hopefully drive some collaboration and work and action plans from your organization and the different departments that need to work hand in hand to identify and address and mitigate the risks that are put forth within your review process. So let's dive in. And if you guys are joining us and have seen and heard my presentations before, we'd love to emphasize this notion of the domino effect as it pertains to financial health reviews and how it can be crippling to your organization when red flags are not addressed, or the domino effect has already started as it pertains to a vendor's declining financial viability and the declining financial performance. So put simply, when the first domino falls, and that first domino could be something like declining vendor income, things like cost cuts and service levels will start to be apparent to mitigate some of the declining income or declining revenue from a vendor's point of view, which has downstream impacts on the overall risk profile of that vendor or third-party relationship. So as such, you want to try to perform financial health reviews with these elements in mind, right? So declining costs, or declining income could lead to cost cuts, which means cutting staff that do very important things for that vendor. That means declining service levels, declining response times, which ultimately could mean high risk in a different area, such as a SOC audit or an information security and privacy point of view or cybersecurity area. So while financial health is definitely focused on things like the income statement, the balance sheet, and cash flow statement, it's at the root of where the businesses that you're working with and the vendors that you're working with invest in their organization as it pertains to their overall risk management policies. So it's a good leading indicator as to whether or not a vendor may have risks in the future. So we'll talk about many of those red flags and some things you can review to get ahead of this and make sure you prevent the domino effect from taking effect in so many ways. So now that you understand what the domino effect is, how can you avoid it and where should you start? So first, it's always important to prioritize conducting financial reviews for key vendors, such as those critical and moderate critical vendors in your TPRM program. You should also define a regular cadence and enforce that cadence across all of your vendors across the board. And you should also document and centralize a lot of your processes and procedures, as we'll highlight later in the presentation. So create that methodology and then create the backbone of that methodology through those documentation policies and procedures. And don't wait for anybody to tell you what to do, whether that be an external regulatory institution or your boss. Try to prioritize these vendor financial health reviews early in your third-party risk management life cycle and an ongoing basis annually at a minimum. So like many things within your third-party risk management program, performing vendor financial health reviews is a cross-collaborative, organizational-wide effort. It starts with a tone at the top from management, and then it trickles down to different personas like your subject matter experts who are performing the reviews, your accounting team that is assisting in performing and reviewing those vendors, your operations team that works around the clock to make sure your contracts are tight and they're enforced, your vendor management team that works directly with the vendor to get more details as it pertains to the findings of those due diligence reports, and then finally your risk management and compliance teams that review the financial health risks identified and assess the impact with reporting back to your management teams and your board. So cross-collaborative effort, you may wear many of these hats. So this doesn't mean that these are 6 independent teams or 6 individuals. It could be one individual doing all 6, but keep these in mind when you're performing your vendor financial health reviews. So every year here at VendMinder, we conduct a State of the Third-Party Risk Management white paper, and in the most recent one we conducted for 2023, 30% of the respondents said that vendors' financial health risk profiles are the most relevant to their organization. So as such, it's important to be defined and documented within your financial health processes, and having processes and procedures as well as documentation through tools or systems you have implemented either internally or through the help of an external partner or provider, so that you can make sure you document and centralize those financial reviews and identify those red flags so you can avoid that domino effect across your vendor base and it doesn't disrupt your operations. So let's dive right into the key financial documentation to collect on vendors. And at a high level, you'll want to combine quantitative and qualitative elements. On the quantitative side, you want to focus on the 3 financial statements: the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement, preferably over multiple years if possible, and preferably audited financials if possible. On the qualitative side, you want to focus on things that provide context to those numbers. So management discussion and analysis, audit opinion letters if available, a management letter if available, and then other supporting documentation such as debt ratings, their sources of funding and capital, and their banking relationship as we discussed earlier. So now that you have the quantitative and qualitative information, you'll want to improve the understanding of the quantitative side with some key ratios to help identify red flags we'll talk about later. These key ratios are metrics from the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. Here's a representative list of those listed here. They focus on things like liquidity, profitability, debt load, the current balance sheet profile, and other areas that help provide additional context as it pertains to those quantitative measures and line items you extract from the information. So oftentimes you get the question of how you get information as it pertains to financials from vendors. On the public side, it's really simple. These are all disclosed within the public domain, such as the SEC website, or if they're international, the CEDR and other websites, or frankly, on the company's website directly. On the private company side or private vendor side, it's a bit more nuanced and difficult. Typically, you'll want to ask the vendor for their audited financials when possible. And if they don't provide those to you, you'll want to try to hold regular check-ins or calls or send inquiries. Otherwise, you'll have to use public sources from other reputable third parties that have some semblance of information on the vendor. Mind you, the data depth might be weaker on those, so keep that in mind as you're performing your financial review and making sure you also include a qualifier or language that says that the data wasn't comprehensive. So what to do when you, again, are facing challenges from private vendors. You always, again, want to start with that gold standard request for the financials. If you don't get, for the audited financials, if you don't get that or you don't have language within your contracts that require a vendor to provide you that, you can try to ask for unaudited company prepared financials that will still help you get a long way. Obviously, data depth may be different from that, but you can utilize those accordingly in your program. If that also fails, you should inquire for some IRS filings, specifically a Form 1120 from that vendor, because they most likely have to file that as they're paying taxes, especially if they're an American company. And that might be sufficient enough to get a sense of their overall financial profile. If you don't get any of the above, you could always, again, revert to asking for a specific financial health letter, and that's usually prepared by a CFO like myself of that vendor or other management team members. And again, if all else or if all of that fails in those preceding requests, you can always rely on a third-party report like a Dun & Bradstreet report or a credit report if they're available. Without these, you can just go work directly with the vendor, but again, chances are they may not be cooperative or responsive. But if you want to still try that, you can always ask very simple and pointed questions like, what is your revenue range? What is your liquidity and cash balance range? And do you have sufficient capital to sustain operations for at least the next 15 months? Those, again, will focus on getting the most bang for your buck with limited time and resources and, frankly, limited cooperation from a vendor. So as we talked about, you want to try to be as comprehensive as possible with your vendor financial reviews. So combining that quantitative and qualitative information in a holistic view can go a long way to take your third-party program and financial health reviews to the next level. So you want to combine those financial statements and those quantitative statements with the qualitative details to arrive at a risk rating. Once those risk ratings are crafted, you can then involve different constituents across your third-party risk management program that we talked about a bit earlier to work through those risks accordingly. If your team members essentially view those risk levels as manageable or acceptable, monitor the vendor on that ongoing basis and move on to the next vendor or workflow. If the risk levels are too high, work to either address those directly with the vendor or do something to put a mitigant in place with your own internal controls. So let's talk a little bit about some examples on why quantitative and qualitative information need to be put together. In example one, we looked at a vendor that had a large revenue base and had strong liquidity and overall financial performance trends. But when you read the qualitative footnotes, you noted that they had legal exposure with the Department of Justice. If you missed that information and just focused on the quantitative side, you wouldn't have identified that risk. On example 2, the vendor had declining performance trends in revenue and other income statement trends such as their profitability, but their liquidity was improved. So overall, when looking at the income statement in isolation, this vendor may be in a poor posture. But when combining the footnotes with the balance sheet liquidity, you noted that they divested some non-core assets to improve their cash position. So again, that combination of quantitative and qualitative information helped provide that full picture of the vendor's financial risks and lack thereof in the certain circumstances we reviewed today. So keep these 2 examples in mind when you're performing reviews on the rest of your vendor universe. So we talked a little bit about what else you can use, but here is a list of items. Again, these are not all encompassing, but we can talk through a couple of them quickly. A going concern opinion is always good. Again, best bang for your buck because someone has already done this review for you, but you shouldn't always rely on anyone else. You should try to do what you can yourself. Other things can be found in subsequent events, legal and litigation issues, and areas of concentration or areas of issues that they've had in certain things like disaster recovery, material security breaches, pending fines, and the sort. So keep these in mind as you're digging in through some of the qualitative side of the information in the financial health review process. And we talked a little bit about some of these, but when you're looking at vendor annual reports, look for things like risk factors because they can preemptively identify some of the key areas as defined by the vendor's point of view. Other things to look for are those legal and litigation exposures and lawsuits, and then that auditor opinion as we talked about when it's available. So use these among other things that we have highlighted in the prior pages. So as we discussed, you've got to perform vendor financial health reviews on a regular cadence, at a minimum annually, but more regularly if needed. So why that's important is because the vendor can have changes in their variables as it pertains to their financial profile. They could grow, they could decline, they could have changes in trends in profitability, they can have changes in liquidity, they can have recent disclosures on material items and risk factors and qualitative disclosures. So make sure you're using a regular cadence and never assume that an old financial health review will be the same because this is a very dynamic environment we live in, both from a macro perspective as well as from a micro individual vendor perspective.
Our third poll question of the day is, what type of tools or systems do you currently utilize to perform and manage vendor financial reviews? Spreadsheets or in-house tools? Specific software or technology? We outsource to a third-party service, or none of the above? And Raman, I have a question here that we can go ahead and answer from the audience. And that question is, we have limited time and want to focus on the most important financial information. What should we focus on?
Thanks, Jesse, and a great question. When you're going through your financial health assessments as it pertains to looking at your vendors, as we'll talk about and as you've talked about already, focusing on the 3 key financial statements, the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement is a great place to start. If a vendor isn't going to provide all 3 of those, and ideally won't provide you a couple of years of those, you can start to ask them for bits and pieces of each of them, with the background or with the caveat being that you may not get anything in return. So when you get that type of pushback, try to focus your primary questions or your must-haves on things like liquidity. So asking the vendor about its total liquidity profile is key, and whether or not they have enough liquidity to support their operations for at least the next 12 to 18 months. And then on top of liquidity, you want to focus on things like outstanding litigation or legal issues they may have that could put them out of business or put them under some exposure from a litigation standpoint, and focus finally on their profitability and their ability to make cash flow or generate cash flow from operations. With those kinds of things in mind, you can at least get some semblance of their ability to perform against their contractual obligations to your organization and other organizations that are their customers. So hopefully that clarifies some of the key areas to focus on if you need to prioritize your time and efforts, or if you're dealing with a challenging vendor that will not share information with you. Back to you, Jay.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question, as it's always interesting to see what everyone says. By the way, in the related content widget, you will find our 6 actions to take after reviewing a vendor's financials infographic. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Raman.
So it's always important to focus on some of the red flags, both in your reviews this year and beyond. So things like declining revenue, profitability, liquidity are always going to be at the top of the list. But make sure you look at some of those qualitative information and disclosures, such as any sort of recent adverse media or news releases, any sort of breaching of covenants, any sort of litigation, or if they're public or have publicly traded debt, look at their lower debt and bond ratings that exist out there. Also focus on things like increased supplier customer churn and concentration, as we've discussed. These are not all encompassing, but should give you enough of a picture and enough red flags to use in your vendor financial health reviews. And finally, it's good to think about some of these questions and ask these questions of yourself and of other people involved in your third-party risk management program and their cross-collaboration across the different business units and departments working alongside. So when you're looking at a vendor relationship, are the vendor's financials better than other providers that you're dealing with or your current provider that you're working with? Have we begun to see that domino effect that we talked about earlier in the presentation? How quickly are we getting to a decision? Who and how can we find someone that provides a similar service if need be in the event of a mitigation strategy? And does the assessment that I perform on a financial health review look beyond the numbers, aka do I go into the qualitative pieces of information we talked about? So ask these questions of yourself at a minimum when you're doing your reviews and performing them on a regular cadence. So to end, here are some key takeaways as reminders and best practices. Always perform financial reviews in the onboarding and ongoing phase. Don't let the domino effect surprise you or affect you. Make sure that everything's not going to be perfect, so start small and evolve your program as it pertains to financial health reviews. Make sure you document and centralize your reviews and cross-collaborate across your organization. Involve folks that are subject matter experts, and then use your contract as a way of enforcement as well as a way to renew them going forward. Thank you for your time today and look forward to answering the rest of your questions and things that you may have. Take care.
Thank you, Raman, for that great session. Before we move on to our next session, where Jill Sherman will discuss the importance of vendor performance management, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 10 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to move into our next session, the importance of vendor performance management, presented by Jill Sherman, Venminder's third-party risk principal. Jill, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Jesse. The agenda today consists of what to measure in third-party risk management, understanding metric types and uses, and identifying the right metrics to report, what should be included in reporting, and reporting to stakeholders. As you can see, reporting is part of the ongoing monitoring phase of the third-party risk management lifecycle. Before you default to thinking that reporting is a boring topic that is typically met with collective groans and glazed eyes, I'm here to tell you that it's more exciting than you think. Stay engaged with me and I'll provide helpful information. When implemented properly, reporting practices will save you time and energy, reduce stress and inconsistency, and instill confidence for your org. Let's delve into reporting, both the concepts and components, so you can integrate these into your org as you see fit. Vendor performance is essential. If your organization isn't managing its vendors' performance, then it isn't managing risk. The truth is, we engage vendors for a reason. They are supposed to help us to fix a problem or to realize an opportunity. Vendor performance management is the key to making sure that those vendors are helping you meet your organization's strategic goals. For example, if I engage a vendor to take over an inefficient process, I need to know that using that vendor is more efficient than performing that activity in-house, and that improving efficiency helps us reach more potential customers, thereby yielding more revenue. But what happens when efficiency is strong, but the output is low quality? Or what if the vendor is pretty efficient, but that doesn't really help us reach more customers? In either case, the organization would need to reevaluate the approach. When it comes to performance management, we need to verify that the vendor is providing products and services as we expect them to, with the right level of quality and the agreed upon price. We need to constantly confirm that the benefit to our organization outweighs the risks posed by the relationship. Here are 3 reasons to manage vendor performance. It enables early detection of emerging risks before an incident occurs. It confirms that the vendor is fulfilling the terms of the contract and delivering value in the relationship. And it also enhances vendor comparison data. Now, everyone wants to jump in with metrics and SLAs, but note, good performance management starts before you even ink the contract. It begins with understanding how a vendor is going to support your organizational goals. If we consider that every organization has organizational goals, then here are some examples. But please keep in mind, no one vendor is going to help you meet all of your goals. However, you should be able to articulate how that vendor contributes or supports your organization in meeting those goals. That understanding and articulation is really the foundation of excellent vendor performance management.
We are to our first poll question after the break. This poll question is, does your organization measure performance by employing a vendor scorecard with metrics? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. And Jill, while we wait for the results to tabulate on this one, let's answer a question from the audience. And that question is, should all of our vendors go through the same steps to offboard?
Jesse, that's a great question. In order to maintain confidence in the program and the steps that are completed thoroughly and consistently, I highly recommend offboarding a vendor in the same fashion for all vendors. When a company is able to establish a series of steps that are sequential, it enables the company to make sure that there aren't any compliance breaches and that they're avoiding any loss of equipment, for instance. And it really cuts down on company time and costs and vendor disputes because the offboarding process is consistent, it's methodical, and it's comprehensive.
Thanks, Jill. Just as a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions that pop up on your screen and be in attendance for the entire live session. If you have any issues submitting your poll, please use the Ask Question widget and we'll be happy to assist. If you have any other questions throughout the session, you can also use the Ask Question widget and we'll try to get to those during our session today. We will be closing this poll out in just about 10 seconds, so please get those responses in quickly. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Here are those results. As a reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find our 3 ways to measure vendor performance infographic. As we are discussing today, measuring vendor performance is an important activity that helps protect your organization's reputation and ensures any issues are identified and addressed quickly, and this resource shares 3 ways to accomplish that. Back to you, Jill.
Here are 4 key components of performance management. 1, established and agreed upon service level agreements known as SLAs and key performance indicators called KPIs. Next, number 2, performance data collection and reporting on scorecards. Number 3, performance review meetings. And number 4, issue management with time-bound tracking and closure. When it comes to vendor performance monitoring and scorecards, it's important to learn how to design and use these tools effectively. Understanding the key differences between a target and a goal, knowing if a measure is subjective or objective, can really make all the difference in effective performance management. It is also advantageous to know when and how you should use a service level agreement versus a key performance indicator. Keep in mind that how you and your organization manage vendor performance is truly up to you. You determine the metrics, data capture, reporting, and issue management for your organization. Some of the concepts I'm sharing today may not work for you, but that's okay. You can cherry pick which techniques you find helpful to incorporate into your business routines. There are endless opinions and methods for performance management. I'm going to use this time to share some of my tried and true methods today that proved to be pretty effective during my TPRM career. Here are 3 best practices for managing vendor performance. Clearly define and document expectations with standards that can be expressed as specific targets that can be measured objectively. 2, establish a formal performance management routine, as it must be a proactive, consistent activity. And 3, ensure that you communicate, collaborate, and be honest with your vendors. Understanding metrics. Metrics are either objective or subjective. Both can be used when evaluating vendor performance. However, we should ensure that objective metrics, also known as quantitative metrics, account for the majority of our metrics. Let's learn more about them to understand why. Objective or quantitative metrics refer to something that can be counted or measured. It's definitive. This metric is based on data, facts, and established criteria with reliable outputs that are unchanging. Examples are listed here, like volumes or quantities, capacity, time, percentages, cost, or number of defects. Subjective, also known as qualitative metrics, are something observed, experienced, or felt. These include opinions, impressions, feelings, and judgments. Outputs are variable and can change depending on the perspective of the individual. Examples include customer or employee satisfaction, personal demeanor, business culture, and visual aesthetics.
The next poll question is, does your organization have SLAs for all of your vendor contracts? yes, no, somewhat, or not sure? And Jill, here's another question for you from the audience. Should we have SLAs for all of our vendor contracts?
This is such a strategic question, Jesse, and a smart one. SLAs, yes, should be incorporated for all vendor contracts. They should be agreed to by both parties. They should be aligned to the technology or business objectives of the engagement. And truly, the SLAs, service level agreements, protect both parties to the agreement. So it's very strategic and thoughtful to incorporate SLAs into all contracts.
Thank you, Jill. We have about a minute left on this open poll question, so please submit those responses. If you'd like to receive the CPE credit for today's session, please remember you must answer all poll questions that appear on your screen during all of today's session, and you must also be in attendance for the entire live session to receive that CPE credit. If you have any questions throughout the day, please submit those via the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist if you need any technical help, or if you want to ask a question, we will try to answer those live on the session today. If we do not get to your live question, we will address that with you via email. We will be closing our poll question in just about 15 seconds, so please get those responses in quickly. Thank you. On your screen now, you will see the poll results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I'd like to direct your attention to our Understanding Vendor Performance Metrics in Scorecards ebook and scorecard template in the related content widget. This is available for download. This ebook and scorecard template are helpful resources as you're reviewing vendor performance.
Service level agreements, also known as SLAs, establish firm, legally binding commitments between your organization and the vendor. These represent non-negotiable service requirements that are identified and outlined into your contract or other written agreement. A requirement for a remedy or stated penalty in case the vendor doesn't meet the commitment, such as a refund, service credit, or discount. Repeated SLA violations can result in the termination of a vendor. SLAs may also be used to incentivize vendors by offering a bonus or other benefit for excellent performance. And key performance indicators are used in support of SLAs, but not in place of them. And note, the term service level agreement should be reserved for those business requirements formalized by a legal agreement. Structuring effective service level agreements. An SLA should define overall SLA objectives. They must state how an external provider will improve performance, save costs, or provide access to skills and or technologies that can't be provided in-house. By doing so, a customer can define the levels of service required to meet these goals, leaving the vendor no questions related to what matters and why. And the SLA should be created with the vendor, meaning both parties to the contract must agree upon the SLA. If you create unachievable or unrealistic SLAs unilaterally, then you can expect the vendor will not agree to them. You can also anticipate that a naive vendor will agree to them initially and then fail to meet the SLAs because they're unrealistic. Best practice is to develop SLAs with both parties to the contract, create them, and negotiate them. Note, each individual product or service should be defined, including a description of the service under contract, where the service is to be provided, for whom it is to be provided, and when it is required. The key to all of this is specificity. Specificity helps in structuring effective service level agreements. In structuring effective service level agreements, also identify performance standards. Specific KPIs and measurements that will substantiate performance must be identified, agreed upon, and memorialized in the SLA. Also, Identify compensation service credits. Any penalties for poor performance or incentives for exceptional performance must be agreed upon and noted in the SLA. Define critical failure. Define what constitutes a critical failure for this particular contract. A critical failure provides grounds for termination of a contract. The best practice: effective SLAs define critical failure for that particular contract. Stating such in the contract enables termination based on specific events happening. Another widely used type of metric is called the KPI, also known as the Key Performance Indicator. These metrics are generally used to measure performance and indicate trends. Similar to SLAs, Key Performance Indicators, or KPIs, should measure the most important aspects of performance. KPIs are also used to help substantiate specific SLAs, but are not necessarily detailed in the contract and don't have specific penalties. KPIs can provide a lot of valuable information, especially when it comes to spotting problems and potential root causes. Now, you don't have to have a ton of KPIs to measure different aspects of a vendor's performance in terms of quality, service, timeliness, customer satisfaction, cost, and defects. You get the picture. Okay, now we're getting into it. Let's talk about data and reporting, because these two elements are really the foundation of any performance evaluation. Now, in many cases, your vendor will be providing data to you to substantiate their performance. That's fine. However, when you are reliant on a data source, you need to occasionally test that data for accuracy. I've personally experienced a situation where performance data depicted one story, but internal operational data illustrated a very different story. At the root of the discrepancy was a misplaced decimal, which caused a variance that yielded crazy results. That conflict required that we dissect all of the data to locate the calculation issue. And if the team had thought about testing the data before there was a glaring error, then that situation would not have occurred. So the moral of the story here is test your data periodically to make sure everything adds up along the way. This validation point will ensure that you are measuring the right factors and enable you to identify an error earlier rather than later. You'll be grateful you did. When establishing metric reporting routines for pulling and reviewing data, the best practice is to look at the service cycle or transaction length of a product or service. Let's use this example. Suppose your lockbox center gets about 80,000 checks per month for payment processing, roughly 20,000 per week. Each one of those payments is going to contribute to the vendor's performance and probably your NPS rating, which is also known as Net Promoter Score, which is a customer loyalty and satisfaction measurement. Each payment presented to the lockbox presents the opportunity for something to go either well or poorly. And sometimes, in some cases, payments can go very poorly. For the lockbox scenario, data should be checked more frequently because if trouble snowballs rapidly, that we're talking about massive volume here. For instance, what if 1 in 10 lockbox payment processing opportunities did not meet quality requirements? You may recognize the failures in the first month and remediate those failures after the first 8,000 payment processing issues because you were vigilant, and good for you. However, if you are not vigilant by waiting for, say, 3 months to pass, during which time 8,000 issues in the first month was replicated by the second and third month, now we're talking about 24,000 lockbox payment processing opportunities that have generated many issues and, of course, resulted in many unhappy local customers. See, in this case, waiting is probably not the best plan. The moral of the story is make sure to consider the service cycle or transaction frequency when you're deciding how often to review data supporting performance. Now, when it comes to formalizing performance reviews, which are documented meetings with your vendor for discussing performance, make sure with your critical and high-risk vendors, you do this at least quarterly. For your moderate risk-rated vendors, make sure you do this once or twice a year. Now, before we leave the slide, I want to emphasize that you shouldn't wait until just before your vendor performance review to look at how the vendor's performing. That's the point of ongoing monitoring in its entirety. It's a constant. The best way to avoid unpleasant surprises is to pay attention to what's going on with these vendors all the time. Be plugged in. All right, now we can discuss scorecards. For purposes of this conversation, I'm going to really speak to those of you who are new to vendor scorecards or are implementing scorecards for the first time. If you have existing scorecards and are a pro, a lot of this information will still apply, so bear with me. Now, there are just as many ways to assemble a scorecard as there are vendors, and there are countless templates, services, and software offerings out there. But we're going to start with a very basic and simple way to assemble a scorecard. First, a good scorecard has essential data on a single page. You can opt to present supporting data along with the scorecard, but don't expect most folks to look beyond the first page. Why do most people focus on the first page only? A lot of organizations have anywhere from 15 to 30 critical vendors, so what you include must be concise and easy visually. Therefore, err on the side of brevity. The elements I recommend to include in your vendor scorecard: vendor performance target, service level agreements, key performance indicator, other metrics, open issues, remediation plans, emerging risks or issues, vendor commentary, and a summary statement. Let's take a look at an example of a scorecard that employs the information presented. Here is a scorecard example for your reference. Resuming with our scorecard example, there are some performance issues and a missed SLA in the previous slide. Regarding the missed SLA in our example, you need to determine whether the penalties apply. You should also document what the expected remedy will be and when that remedy will be applied. Also, note that the very high-level description for remediation plans, this summary does not preclude you from retaining a detailed, documented remediation plan agreement between your organization and the vendor. In the example, both the missed SLA occurrence and the detailed remediation plan should be retained in the vendor record. Who should be responsible for evaluating vendor performance? Well, vendor owners. They're responsible and accountable for effectively managing vendor performance, managing issues, and their remediation, and holding the vendor accountable. As they say, the buck stops here with vendor owners for performance management. Third-party management, or vendor risk management, oversees the vendor performance management process. This team is responsible for ensuring that results are documented, issues are tracked, and vendor owners are accountable. And last, senior management is responsible for confirming the policy is enforced and that vendor owners and their third-party management or vendor risk management teams are doing their jobs. This slide focuses on key takeaways. These key takeaways should be considered when you're designing your routines for reporting for your organization. Remember, reporting falls in the ongoing monitoring phase of the third-party risk management lifecycle. Make sure when you're designing your reporting routines that you articulate how the vendor is supporting your organizational goals. You use SLAs in your contract for enforcing the most important or non-negotiable requirements. You balance objective and subjective performance measures. You track KPIs over time for identifying trends. You test performance data periodically. You consider service cycle or transaction length when determining how often to review performance data. You always document and track vendor performance issues. You require documented remediation plans and monitor those. And you remember, keep scorecards simple. Brevity is key.
Thank you, Jill, for that informative session. I'd now like to pass it over to Hillary Dewhurst, VenMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, who will wrap up our 3-day boot camp with a discussion around program metrics and reporting in third-party risk management. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Okay, to wrap up our session today, we're really going to talk about third-party risk management reporting. We're going to talk about what that is and what we should consider. We're going to talk about how to identify some metrics and what sources of data you might use. And then we're going to put it all together for you and end with some key takeaways. So let's get started. You know, unlike different steps and activities across the life cycle, third-party risk management reporting takes place across the entire life cycle. It is part of our foundation. So we want to keep in mind that at any point in the process, we are maybe reporting on those activities, and we're also monitoring the success and health of the program overall. So, if you're wondering why third-party risk management reporting is part of that foundation of the life cycle, I think it's really essential to do things like keep the senior management and the board informed and updated. You know, that's a regulatory requirement for many of us. We also need to make sure that the program and all the activities are happening as they should and taking place on time. We also want to manage and track any issues that come up for us. And we want to take this information and really use it to help us plan our capacity both now and in the future. We also, of course, always want to drive information to our stakeholders and use the reporting as the facts we need to drive action. Just a few key considerations as we're talking about reporting today, and that is for your data. It's really important to make sure that all your data is accessible. That means we can get to it. We don't have to go through a bunch of hoops just to get the data, and that the data is relevant to the specific report, so it's easy to digest. We also want to make sure that that data is always accurate and repeatable, and most of all, that it is timely. To think about what types of reports you should be issuing, you know, there's certainly many options, but there are a few reports that I feel are essential for any third-party risk management program. And the first and foremost is going to be a report on your vendor inventory that tells you not only the name of the vendor and who owns the relationship, but the products and services they're providing and if they are critical or non-critical to your organization. And speaking of critical, we do need a separate report that just talks about our critical vendors. We need to know the names, the products, the services, which engagements they're involved in, who owns that relationship, and if there's any open issues. Another really important report, if you don't have it, I think it's essential, is a PII detail list. So for every vendor that accesses, processes, transmits, or stores PII, you have a list of exactly which PII components they are managing. The next one is risk assessments or risk reassessments. We need to know where everyone is in this process. We need to make sure that all risk assessments and reassessments are current, and if any are late or way past due. We also need an issue management report that details all of the information around the issue as well as the severity, who owns the remediation, and the timing. A contract report is also highly recommended so we can keep track of all those renewal dates, and keep in mind that we do want to list any associated statements of work or other information related to that contract in that report. we do need a list of vendor due diligence documentation that we have on file, and that should include the expiration dates of any of those documents that expire, like SOC reports or insurance certificates. We also need a vendor performance report to really see which of the vendors are meeting all of their contractual obligations and the KPIs that we expect from them. And we do want to look at their performance over 12 to 18 months just so that we can have a trend and include a summary on that report. Okay, so we've talked about what we should be reporting. Now let's talk about who we should be reporting to. In general, you're going to have a lot of different stakeholders, and those specific reports are going to vary based on their needs. But I do want to focus on three really key stakeholder groups. And the first one is going to be risk committee. You know, most organizations have some sort of risk committee, which generally has the collective role of identifying and mitigating risk before they become material issues for the organization. So your third-party risk management reporting should provide a regular view of program compliance and focus on new and emerging risks, any vendor issues, or any items requiring action. Because once an issue is identified, a treatment plan needs to be established. And it's always best to present any issues needing attention to the risk committee first. That way, you've got the right people at the table to help solve the problem, and they get engaged before that issue shows up on a senior management or board report. Second, we have senior leadership. So your organization's senior leadership, senior management, and that includes the executive level, is ultimately accountable for the health, stability, and effectiveness of your third-party risk management program. And they're going to need to make decisions accordingly. So reporting to senior management should highlight the things that need their approval or their influence and include a standard set of metrics. And lastly, we have the board of directors. The board of directors is accountable for the third-party risk management oversight overall. So data provided to the board should enable them to assess if the program is effective and if it's working as intended. Reporting to this group of stakeholders should include a very high level of the program size, risk exposure, compliance, and material risk issues. So what you report and how often is important. And I just want to make sure that we're thinking about what type of information we should be giving at the right time. So for monthly reporting, and this could be for your direct line of management or a vendor risk committee or even the line of business, we need to focus on what the stakeholders need to know or do now. It also could include what's coming up for the next 30 days regarding any deliverables, and we would like to provide a status of any issue remediation as well. When we're talking about this quarterly report, this might be that general risk committee or similar governing body. We want to use our report not only to provide a picture of the program and what's going on, but also to drive specific issues that need action or intervention. And this reporting should also provide the foundation for any short-term planning. When it comes to annual reporting, this should be for the board or senior leadership, and they need enough information to ensure that our program is on track and effective. We need to show them how we stack up against our defined program metrics and that we have strong internal compliance. We need to share any results of any audit exam or regulatory changes. And it's also a great time to highlight any noteworthy third-party risk management program successes or challenges and the plan for the next 1 to 2 years. As a recommendation, if you can influence the timing, this report should be a companion presentation to the board as part of their annual policy review and update. Okay, so now I want to talk about developing metrics and reporting to help measure the overall effectiveness and health of your program. And there are a lot of reasons to do this. We want to stay on top of those issues. We want to know if the program is in compliance. And you know, for many industries, this type of reporting is a regulatory requirement because the board and senior management are ultimately accountable for the organization's program for third-party risk management. And even if you're not regulated, your management is still going to need the information to determine how effective and stable that program is and understand the amount and severity of risk in the portfolio. But we can also use this data to confirm compliance, both internally and to external regulations, and make decisions around that for the program. You know, of course, when we're thinking about these types of metrics and reporting, we're going to want to think about all those life cycle activities and tasks. But there's other things we need to consider as well, such as the internal compliance with the policy. And, you know, are the vendor owners giving us good quality deliverables on time? You know, have there been any audit or exam observations, findings, or issues? You know, how efficient are our processes? You know, how much can we handle? How much capacity do we have? And there's so many more. So before you get all anxious about this, just keep in mind that more data does not equal better information. There's a lot of metrics we can use out there, but we really want to zero on the ones that can best measure our program against our strategic objectives and goals for third-party risk management. So just taking that time to really suss through those is really important. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so what does it take to identify and define those metrics? Well, we have a 10-step approach. Here's just a brief overview, but we'll go through it in more detail so that you can understand. So let's start with, to begin, you're just going to want to think about why your organization uses third-party risk management in the first place. For many of us, it's going to be things like regulatory compliance. You know, we want to mitigate that vendor risk. Maybe we want to do a better job of vendor selection and use. Whatever it is, think about your reasons for third-party risk management in your organization. And then we're going to want to prioritize that list. Let's take off the top 3 to 5 goals here. So the first one is going to be regulatory compliance in this example, then vendor risk, and then vendor performance and value. From there, once we've identified the top objective, it's time to start identifying some possible metrics for each area. So for example, if we're all about compliance, maybe we want to look at critical vendors with current risk reviews or that are out of compliance with the program. We might look at customer complaints or other internal program compliance failures. If we want to mitigate vendor risk, you know, maybe we're looking at the inherent risk versus residual risk for all of our critical and high-risk vendors, or past due vendor issues, or the key risks that we're identifying and monitoring. And if it's about vendor performance, maybe we want to report on how many vendors are meeting or exceeding their service level agreements, or vendors with tested BCDR plans. Now, when it comes to where you might find those metrics, a really obvious starting point is the activities in the third-party risk management lifecycle. Are they happening? Are they happening on time? You know, are there any issues? But we can also look for metrics that reflect program operations. So how many vendor owners have been trained? You know, how satisfied are the stakeholders? How many resources do we have? We could also look at governance to see if there's been any audit, exam issues or findings, if there, you know, how issues and escalations are going, and then overall program risk management. So how many risks have we identified? What risks did we not avoid? You know, what were those issues? Are there any new or emerging risks? And has the impact of any risk changed? And just like there are many metrics, there are many possible data sources. So of course you have your third-party risk management system, but you could also be pulling data from accounts payable, your organizational issue management tracking system, maybe your InfoSec tools and reporting, you know, stakeholder satisfaction surveys, etc. So when it comes to your potential metrics and you're thinking about them, here's a few things to consider. Is the data accessible and reliable? Can you get it without jumping through a bunch of hoops? You know, how easy is it to calculate that metric? So we're using a lot of really complex formulas from multiple spreadsheets. That may not be the best thing. Is the metric better to use as a key performance indicator, you know, something that's already happened, or a key risk indicator, something that can alert us to potential risks? And what action will we take if the particular metric is not within the threshold? So This is a really important one because if you are measuring things that you have no capacity, desire, or ability to act on, may not be the best metric. And then, of course, does the metric help tell the right story? I apologize because we're going to go through these very quickly, but I just want to give you some examples of types of metrics you can use. So for operational, maybe you're looking at the percentage of issues remediated within a specific time frame, maybe the number of process exceptions, how many engagements are risk rated. For compliance, you might want to look at the percentage of contracts in compliance with minimum terms and conditions, or the number of vendor compliance incidences, or internal business unit compliance. From a risk perspective, we might look at the percentage of inherent risk assessments that are inaccurate. Did we have anybody answer those questions wrong? Percentage of critical and high-risk vendors with open issues. Maybe the percentage of vendors that had a cybersecurity event. Again, internal business unit compliance, or the ratio of third-party risk management employees against the number of vendors we have rated moderate and above. Now, it's a really good idea and highly recommended that you keep a mix of key performance indicators, or KPIs, and key risk indicators, or KRIs, as your metrics, because KPIs can confirm something that's already happened. They can tell us that the program is performing as it should, but KRIs can provide actionable data that we can use to prevent risks from occurring or from worsening. Now, a really good strategy when considering your metrics is to think about metrics both in terms of being a KPI and KRI. Now, as an example, if we want to measure the percentage of engagements that have been risk rated from a KPI perspective, that can help us demonstrate operational effectiveness, compliance with our policy, and internal program compliance. But from a risk perspective, we know that if this percentage gets beyond our accepted tolerance, that we have a higher likelihood of business interrupting events. We could get some findings during audits and exams. We could have reputational damage or financial loss. So the metrics are only part of the story. We also need to set some thresholds, because if the metric is not within the acceptable threshold, then we need to take action. So for example, maybe a threshold might be that we don't want more than 15% of all of our vendors that are moderate rated and above to be considered critical. Maybe with the risk reviews completed on time, that we want that to be at 97% or higher. Or maybe the ratio of third-party risk management teams to the number of vendors, for every 200 vendors, we have at least one full-time employee. Whatever it is, you do need to set some thresholds. So some of the challenges you might come up against is that the data you need for that metric is just too hard to get, or it's just too hard to interpret. And that may be because there's too many data points that are required to calculate a single metric. The other thing is maybe the data isn't telling the right story, it's not measuring the right dimension, or when it goes out of tolerance, there's not really an action that can be taken. Okay, so before you finalize everything, there's just a few things to do. And one is to make sure you test your data sources and your calculations. Are we getting good, repeatable data and reports? We also want to review the story we're trying to tell, right? Are those metrics in support of those top line objectives? Are they demonstrating regulatory compliance? Are they demonstrating vendor risk management? Are they demonstrating cost savings? Whatever it may be. We want to make sure that we review all the final proposed metrics with our stakeholders, and if they're not quite working, we need to be prepared to revise them. So what types of reports that we might be pulling already could we use in support of these metrics? Well, here are a few examples. First of all, your vendor inventory. You can definitely get a lot of information for your third-party risk management program metrics from those reports. your risk assessment report. That can tell you a lot about compliance, what's past due, what's upcoming, and then your program compliance. Are your business lines following the required processes and procedures for third-party risk management? So if not, what are the issues? Are there late or missing deliverables? Your vendor issues report, of course, there's going to be a lot of data in there that can help you support your program metrics. We also want to make sure that we're keeping track of any new or emerging risks, and we can look at the risk assessments or risk reassessments. You know, is there something going on within the industry or any trends in vendor performance that we need to address? We also need to always think about regulatory considerations if there's been any proposed updates or changes, and we need to understand how those changes are going to affect the program, process, and governance documents. And then finally, for all of it, we need a reporting timeline that shows the cadence of the reports, not just that we're planning for third-party risk management, but also these third-party risk management program reports. Okay, I know we've covered a lot, but here's just some things to keep us moving forward and keep us grounded. Just keep those initial metrics limited to 3 to 5 per objective initially. We do not want to report on everything, the whole kitchen sink. We really want to limit it to what is most relevant and tells the right story. That means let's not get stuck in analysis paralysis. You know, some metrics are really great. Some are not so great, and sometimes you don't really know until you're using them over time, and then, you know, you may need to refine them, and that's okay. Make sure you consult with other internal risk domains because they may have a lot of information, suggestions, or experience that they can share with you. And then always stay open to feedback and constructive criticism because at the end of the day, we want to have the best metrics possible.
We are to our last poll question of the day. And that question is, would your organization be interested in knowing how mature your third-party risk management program is? Yes, as soon as possible. Yes, maybe within the next year. No, not our focus at the moment, or you're not sure. And Hillary, there's another question from the audience that I think we could answer.
Great.
Do the regulators require you have third-party risk management program metrics?
You know, they don't really. And the important thing to remember here is we don't really want to develop our program metrics because it's a regulatory requirement. The reason that we want to do this is it can really help our senior management and our board understand how well the program is working. It can help us identify areas that might have some issues. Maybe we have some less than optimal internal compliance. And it really provides the information to help you target those areas that need improvement or maybe ask for additional resources or even get that support from senior management to kind of move the dial on that internal compliance. You know, we put a lot into our programs and they're very complex. And unfortunately, sometimes third-party risk is sort of like the stepchild. So these program metrics can really help you demonstrate how much goes into it, how well it's working, and just give you more visibility and support overall. I hope that helps.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Just a reminder, if you have any issues submitting your poll answers, please feel free to send us a message via the Ask Question widget. Or if you have other questions that you'd like to ask, you can also ask them within the Ask Question widget. We will be closing this poll momentarily. Thank you. Here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Before we move on, we have our How to Report Vendor Risk Management Activity to the Board toolkit and the related content widget. This toolkit contains an infographic, Word template, and PowerPoint template to assist you. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
Now, once you've decided what your metrics are and you have some agreement with your stakeholders, it's great to put it all together in kind of a simple format so that everyone can see what's going on. You can do that either in the scorecard, you know, with graphics and charts. You can use the red, amber, green or sort of that traffic light color coding, or you can even use a single spreadsheet. It's really not as important as it is that the stakeholders know what they're looking at and what the information means. Just some key takeaways for this last session. Reporting is super essential for our third-party risk management programs. Not only do we have to help our stakeholders understand what's going on, but we need to make sure that we're doing things like reinforcing internal compliance, we're keeping the board and senior management updated, and we want to make sure that the ways we measure our program are consistent with our organizational objectives for third-party risk management. With that, thank you for your time today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie. Jessie?
Thank you, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I'd like to thank everyone for attending our third and final day of boot camp. We appreciate your participation, engagement, and questions. I'd also like to thank our experts from today, Hillary, Raman, and Jill, for their time in sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you'll see our upcoming webinars. On May 2nd, the third-party risk management lifecycle, Managing Vendor Risk from Start to Finish webinar. And on May 16th, our third-party risk management reports, right data, frequency, and content webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Raman, this next question will come to you. The vendor we assessed has declining revenue. How should we think about the financial health risk profile trend?
Thanks for that question, and obviously thanks to everyone today. Hillary hopefully is getting a drink of water after 2 long presentations to you all, so thank you all for participating. But going back to the financial health and performing vendor reviews, looking at things like revenue in isolation, and particularly one that shows declining performance, is certainly an indication or a red flag, but you'll want to juxtapose it against some of the other components we talked about earlier today. So things like their profitability or cost cuts they've implemented, which ideally doesn't lead to a domino effect, but perhaps could lead to offsetting losses from the revenue side and preventing certain issues from a profitability side from occurring. Also, you want to look at the footnotes and make sure you get an understanding of why they have declining revenue. So really try to dig into some of those other quantitative pieces of information on either the income statement, the balance sheet, or the cash flow statement, and complement that with the review of the footnotes and the management discussion analysis to understand that context as to why revenue is declining. Although in isolation it might be a red flag, it still may overall point to a broader picture. So keep that in mind when you're performing your reviews. Back to you, Jessie.
Thanks, Raman. Jill, we will come over to you for this next question. And that question is, could you please explain the difference between quantitative and qualitative work?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessie. The difference is significant as they measure different things, so let's make sure to hammer the definitions home as we refer to them a lot today. Quantitative metrics are those that you can measure in a specific formula. They are mathematical data, typically. Think measurable, definite, repeatable, and trackable. Examples like renewal rates. On the other hand, qualitative metrics measure qualities. And they are more of a subjective opinion and are formed based on information you receive, something you perceive. They're based on feelings and preference, like personal taste. Examples are customer feedback and customer satisfaction. Think subjective, imprecise, kind of messy, because they're based on perception and mood. That's a great question. Hope this helps.
Thank you, Jill. Hillary, we'll come over to you for this next question.
Okay.
Great. What kind of reporting should the business units get from third-party risk management?
You know, that's a great question. And I feel like there's a lot of room for interpretation here. But at a minimum, we want to make sure that the business unit has access to the vendors that are associated with their vendor owners within that business line, buy that product and service with their risk rating. We also want to make sure that they have a report that details when those risk assessments are due and what part of the process they're in, because nothing frustrates those vendor owners more than watching their vendors go into due diligence and not knowing where they are in the process or how long that's going to take. So that report can be very useful. But I also think another great report is to just have a running list of upcoming deliverables related to those vendors. That could really help people have better internal compliance when they just have that extra look of what's coming up for them. Those are just a few. There's many more, but I hope that helps.
Thanks, Hillary. And we'll actually stay with you for this next question.
Okay.
That question is, why is the SEC leading the charge on ESG and why not other regulators?
That's a great question. I think one of the most interesting things about the SEC sort of leading that charge is because they really can tackle all public companies, and other regulators are kind of limited, like you have the OCC and FDIC that are really for financial institutions. And, so the SEC has the broadest reach with that particular initiative. So I think that's one of the primary drivers for them leading the charge is it can affect the greatest number of companies at the same time.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, Raman, and Jill, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address with you offline. We'd like to thank all our presenters over the last 3 days and all of you for attending. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank and online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record each day of the boot camp, and those recording links will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. Once again, thank you to all of our experts for another great boot camp, and thank you to everyone in our audience for taking the time to join us around our virtual campfire and listen in. If you submitted a question but it wasn't answered live, don't worry, we will follow up with you via email. On behalf of InMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.